Love crosses boundaries when his daughter forms a connection with the family's driver. Her decision sends ripples through the family, challenging traditions and expectations. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of the Morrison Mansion buzzed with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the gathering of CEOs, politicians, and old money families who filled the space. Claire Morrison stood near the champagne fountain, tugging at the collar of her designer dress that felt more like a straitjacket with each passing minute. Her sister Sophie glided through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting compliments about her recent engagement to a senator's son. Claire watched as Sophie worked the room, every gesture and laugh perfectly calculated. The contrast between them had never been more apparent. Sophie thrived in these gatherings, while Claire counted the minutes until she could escape. Another fascinating conversation about hedge funds? Thomas Lancaster, a family friend's son, approached with 2 champagne flutes. Claire accepted one out of politeness, though alcohol was the last thing she needed. "I'm more interested in actual hedges," Claire replied, scanning the room. "At least they serve a purpose." Thomas laughed too loudly, drawing attention from nearby guests. "Your father mentioned you've been volunteering at that community center downtown. Surely that's just for the foundation's publicity." Claire's grip tightened on her glass. Before she could respond, she caught sight of Jamal near the entrance. He stood straight-backed in his driver's uniform, professional and dignified despite the dismissive glances from passing guests. Their eyes met briefly, and Claire felt her chest tighten. "Excuse me," she mumbled to Thomas, placing her untouched champagne on a passing server's tray. She made her way toward the entrance, only to be intercepted by her mother. "Darling, the Whitneys just arrived. Their son Marcus is starting at Harvard Law this fall." Her mother's smile was razor-sharp. "I mentioned you might show him around the city." Claire nodded mechanically, her attention still fixed on Jamal. He had moved toward the terrace doors, his presence barely noticed by the party guests who treated service staff like furniture. Something in his posture suggested he wanted her to follow. "Mom, I need some air," Claire said, already stepping away. The room's getting stuffy. The terrace provided blessed relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. Jamal stood at the far end, gazing out over the city lights. Claire approached slowly, conscious of the glass doors behind them and the potential observers within. "Rough night?" Jamal asked without turning around. His voice carried the hint of amusement that drew her to him in the first place. "These parties get worse every time," Claire replied, joining him at the railing. "How do you stand watching it all?" "It's educational." He turned to face her, his expression softening. "Like a nature documentary about peacocks, but with better champagne." Claire laughed genuinely for the first time that evening. The sound carried across the terrace, drawing Sophie's attention through the glass. Her sister's disapproving stare was impossible to miss. "Your sister's watching," Jamal noted quietly. "She's always watching." Claire moved slightly closer, defiant. "Always judging." They stood in comfortable silence, the party's muted sounds creating a barrier between their world and the one inside. Claire studied Jamal's profile, noting how the city lights highlighted his features. The connection between them felt tangible in these stolen moments. "I should get back," Jamal finally said, though he made no move to leave. "Your father might need the car brought around soon." "Stay," Claire whispered. "Just a few more minutes." When they eventually returned inside, Sophie cornered Claire near the powder room. "Are you trying to cause a scandal?" she hissed. "Half the room saw you out there with him." Claire felt the weight of her growing feelings for Jamal press against her chest. "Maybe it's time for a scandal in this family." Sophie's face hardened. "Don't be naive, Claire. You know this can't go anywhere. Think about what it would do to Dad's reputation." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical small talk. But Claire's thoughts remained fixed on those few precious minutes on the terrace, and the realization that her feelings for Jamal had grown far deeper than she'd allowed herself to admit. The aroma of spices filled the modest apartment as Jamal sat at his mother's kitchen table. The space was small but immaculate, filled with photos of family members and academic achievements. His mother, Amara, stirred a pot of curry while stealing concerned glances at her son. I received my LSAT results today, Jamal announced, sliding an envelope across the worn tabletop. Scored in the 95th percentile. Amara turned from the stove, her face lighting up momentarily before clouding with worry. That's wonderful, but she hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. The application fees, the tuition, I've been saving, Jamal interrupted. And there are scholarships. Columbia has a diversity program. Columbia? Amara set down her spoon. You mean where all those wealthy families send their children? Where that girl goes? Jamal's jaw tightened. Claire, he said. Her name is Claire. I see how you look at her. Amara sat across from her son. And how she looks at you. That's what worries me most. Mom, the world hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think, Jamal. Those people, they'll never truly accept you, no matter how many degrees you earn or cases you win. Before Jamal could respond, his phone buzzed. Claire's name appeared on the screen. She wanted to visit his neighborhood to understand his world better. The request both thrilled and terrified him. Later that afternoon, Claire stepped out of her regular clothes and into jeans and a simple sweater, arriving at the community center where Jamal volunteered. The building's paint was peeling, but the sounds of children laughing and the smell of fresh coffee from the local shop made it feel more alive than any country club she'd ever visited. Jamal led her through the neighborhood, past corner stores with handwritten signs and elderly residents who greeted him by name. He showed her the basketball court where he coached kids on weekends and the library where he studied for his LSAT. This is where I grew up, he explained, gesturing to a modest apartment building. My mom still lives on the 3rd floor. Claire absorbed everything, noting how people treated each other with genuine warmth rather than the calculated networking she was accustomed to. It feels real here, she said softly, not like the artificial world I live in. Their walk ended at a small park where local artists had painted murals celebrating the community's diversity. As they sat on a bench, Claire reached for Jamal's hand, ignoring the curious glances from passersby. I want to understand everything about your life, she said, not just the parts that fit into my world. The moment was interrupted by Claire's phone ringing. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. Claire declined the call, but moments later, a text appeared. Mom and Dad are asking where you are. You need to come home now. Back at the Morrison mansion, Sophie cornered Claire in her bedroom. Are you trying to destroy everything our family has built? She demanded. Do you know what people would say if they knew where you'd been today? Maybe they'd say I'm finally living authentically, Claire shot back. Unlike everyone in our social circle who's just playing a part. Wake up, Claire. Sophie's voice rose. This isn't some romantic movie where love conquers all. Here are realities you need to face. What about your future? The foundation? Your responsibilities? My responsibilities? Claire laughed bitterly. You mean marrying someone Dad approves of and hosting charity galas for the rest of my life? It's who we are, Sophie insisted. It's your heritage. Claire felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her. The day with Jamal had shown her a different way of living, one based on genuine connections rather than social calculations. But Sophie's words struck at her deepest insecurities. You can't have both worlds, Sophie continued, softer now. Someone always gets hurt in these situations, usually everyone. Claire turned to her window, looking out at the manicured gardens below. The contrast between this manufactured perfection and the vibrant, real world she'd experienced with Jamal couldn't have been starker. She felt torn between two worlds, each pulling her in opposite directions. I need to figure this out for myself, Claire finally said, without everyone telling me what I should do or who I should be. Sophie moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. Just remember, every choice has consequences. And in our world, those consequences affect more than just you. The confrontation erupted in Richard Morrison's study, a room designed to intimidate with its dark wood paneling and wall of family portraits dating back generations. Richard stood behind his mahogany desk, his face flushed with anger as he stared down at Jamal. How dare you? Richard's voice was controlled but venomous. First you abuse your position in this household, and now you have the audacity to stand here defending it. Jamal maintained his composure, though his hands were clenched at his sides. Sir, I have nothing but respect for Claire and your family. Respect. Richard barked out a harsh laugh. You call secretly dating my daughter respect? Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation? To our business relationships? Claire is capable of making her own decisions, Jamal replied steadily. She's not a business asset. Richard circled his desk slowly, like a predator. Let me be clear. You are nothing more than an employee, a replaceable one. Your presence in Claire's life is inappropriate and ends now. Or should I make some calls to the law schools you're applying to? The threat hung in the air. Jamal felt the weight of his mother's warnings, of years of systemic barriers, pressing down on him. Without another word, he turned and left the study, passing Claire in the hallway without meeting her eyes. Jamal, wait! Claire called after him, but he kept walking. She burst into her father's study. What did you say to him? I said what needed to be said, Richard replied coldly. This ends now, Claire. I won't have you throwing away your future for some misguided rebellion. Rebellion. Claire's voice shook with fury. Is that what you think this is? I love him. Love? Her father scoffed. You don't know anything about love. You're young, naive. I know that love isn't about social status or business connections. Claire shot back. I know it's not about maintaining appearances or satisfying shareholders. Eleanor Morrison appeared in the doorway, attracted by the raised voices. Claire, darling, please try to understand. Understand what, Mom? That my happiness means nothing compared to the family image? That I'm just another asset to be managed? That's enough. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. You will end this nonsense with the driver, or what? Claire challenged. You'll cut me off? Lock me in my room? We're not living in the 1950s anymore, Dad. The argument escalated until Claire stormed out, slamming the heavy study door behind her. She rushed to her room, throwing clothes into a bag while angry tears streamed down her face. Sophie appeared in her doorway. Where are you going? Sophie asked quietly. Anywhere but here. Claire continued packing. I can't breathe in this house anymore. Everything's fake. The smiles, the conversations, the relationships. All of it. You're being dramatic, Sophie sighed. Just give it some time. Let things cool down. Claire zipped her bag shut with unnecessary force. Time for what? For Dad to arrange a suitable marriage? For you all to pretend this never happened? For you to think clearly, Sophie pressed. You're throwing away everything. I'm not throwing away anything worth keeping. Claire shouldered her bag. I need space. From all of this. She left that night, checking into a hotel rather than involving any of her friends who would undoubtedly report back to her parents. Alone in the sterile room, Claire felt both terrified and oddly free. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her family, but one number remained silent, Jamal's. Days passed. Claire withdrew from the social obligations that had always filled her calendar. She ignored the charity board meetings, the gallery openings, the lunch dates arranged by her mother. Instead, she spent time walking the city streets, seeing them through new eyes, Jamal's eyes. The distance gave her clarity. She realized that her life had been a carefully constructed facade, designed to please everyone except herself. But the thought of Jamal's silence, of her father's threats, of the very real consequences they both faced, weighed heavily on her heart. The community center's basement was packed with folding chairs and hopeful faces. Parents and children from the neighborhood filled every available space, their attention focused on the small stage where community leaders discussed educational initiatives. Jamal sat in the back, his law school acceptance letter heavy in his pocket. We need to show our youth that their dreams are valid. Marcus Thompson, a local activist, addressed the crowd. That they can break cycles and create new paths. Education isn't just about books. It's about believing you deserve a seat at the table. Jamal felt the words resonate deeply. He'd been asked to speak about his journey from community center volunteer to Columbia Law School acceptee. As he waited for his turn, he noticed a familiar figure slip quietly through the door. Claire stood at the back, dressed simply but still somehow standing out. She hadn't expected to see Jamal here. She'd come after reading about the event online, drawn by the community's spirit she'd witnessed during her previous visit. Next, we'd like to hear from someone many of you know, Marcus announced. Jamal Adams has been tutoring our kids for years. and now he's headed to Columbia Law. The room erupted in genuine applause. Children Jamal had tutored cheered his name. He approached the podium, his prepared speech forgotten when he saw Claire. "I grew up 3 blocks from here," Jamal began, his voice steady. "My mom worked 2 jobs to keep our lights on. But this center, this community, gave me something money couldn't buy: belief. Every person in this room who told me I could make it, who stayed late to help me study, who shared what little they had. You're the real definition of wealth." As he spoke, Jamal shared stories of the kids he'd worked with. A 12-year-old girl who'd improved 3 grade levels in reading. A teenage boy who'd gone from potential dropout to honor roll student. With each story, he emphasized the power of community support and education. Claire watched transfixed. She saw a side of Jamal that went beyond their personal connection. A natural leader, someone who lifted others as he climbed. The children in the audience looked at him with admiration, seeing in him a future they could achieve. After the formal presentations, the event transformed into an informal gathering. Parents shared homemade dishes, children ran between chairs, and conversations flowed freely. Jamal found himself surrounded by kids eager to show him their recent test scores and homework assigned. "Mince, Mr. Jamal, are you really going to be a lawyer?" one young boy asked, eyes wide with wonder. "That's the plan," Jamal replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "And maybe someday you'll be one too," Claire observed from a distance, noting how natural Jamal was with the children. He wasn't just teaching them academics. He was showing them they could dream bigger than their circumstances suggested. Eventually, Jamal noticed Claire watching him. Their eyes met across the room, and the weight of everything unspoken hung between them. She saw in him not just the man she'd fallen for, but someone who could change lives. Someone who understood that true value wasn't measured in bank accounts or social standings. The event coordinator approached Jamal, breaking their eye contact. "We'd love to start a law prep program," she said. "Something to help kids see that legal careers aren't just for people from privileged backgrounds. Would you consider leading it?" "Every Saturday," Jamal replied without hesitation. "We can start with basic civic education, work our way up to LSAT prep." Claire moved closer, drawn into the conversation. "I could help," she offered quietly. "I know people who could serve as mentors, provide internship opportunities." The coordinator looked between them, sensing the tension, but choosing to focus on the potential impact. "That would be incredible. These kids need to see that different worlds can work together." The evening continued, with Claire gradually being drawn into conversations with community members. She learned about their struggles, their dreams, their determination to create better opportunities for their children. It was a world away from the superficial concerns that dominated her usual social circle. As the event wound down, Claire helped stack chairs while Jamal said goodbye to the families. They worked in silence, both aware of the growing realization that their connection went beyond romance. It was about bridging worlds, about creating change. "Your speech was amazing," Claire finally said, breaking the silence. "This is who I am," Jamal replied simply. "This community, these kids, they're my purpose." "I know," Claire said softly. "That's what makes you extraordinary." The restaurant was exactly the kind of place Claire had grown to despise. All crystal stemware and hushed conversations about stock portfolios. Her parents had arranged this dinner with James Henderson, a 30-year-old venture capitalist whose family had old money connections with the Morrisons. "Your father mentioned you're interested in social causes," James said, cutting into his Wagyu steak. "My firm has a wonderful charitable foundation, very tax efficient." Claire stared at her untouched plate. "I'm more interested in actual change than tax write-offs." Eleanor Morrison shot her daughter a warning look across the table. Claire has been exploring different philanthropic approaches, she interjected smoothly. "Perhaps you could show her how your foundation operates, James?" "Of course," James smiled, revealing perfectly whitened teeth. "We could discuss it over drinks at my family's house in the Hamptons this weekend." Claire's fork clattered against her plate. "I can't do this," she announced, standing abruptly. The surrounding tables fell silent. "Claire," her father warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Sit down." Instead, Claire turned to James. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this charade. I'm sure you're very nice, in a privileged, disconnected from reality sort of way. But I'm not interested. She strode toward the exit, her mother's embarrassed apologies fading behind her. Her father caught up with her in the restaurant's opulent lobby, grabbing her arm. Enough! Richard Morrison's face was red with fury. You're acting like a child. No, Dad. I'm finally acting like an adult. Claire yanked her arm free. An adult who can make her own choices. Choices? He laughed bitterly. Let's talk about choices. You choose to embarrass your family. You choose to throw away every advantage we've given you. For what? Some driver with delusions of grandeur. Jamal is more genuine, more impactful than anyone in your social circle. Claire shot back. He's changing lives while you all just change stock portfolios. Is that what you think? Richard's voice turned cold. Then let's make this simple. You want to make your own choices? Fine. Choose between your trust fund and this misguided romance. Eleanor appeared behind them, wringing her hands. Richard, please. No, let's be clear, Richard continued. If you continue this relationship with the driver, you lose everything. Your trust fund, your position at the foundation, your inheritance, all of it. Claire felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. You still don't get it, do you? You think money is the answer to everything. The solution to every problem. The measure of every person. Money is reality, Richard snapped. Ask your boyfriend how far his noble intentions will get him without it. How many lives he can change when he can't even pay his own bills. This isn't about money, Claire's voice shook with emotion. This is about you trying to control my life, just like you control everything else. Control? Richard stepped closer. I built an empire for you and your sister. Everything I've done has been to secure your future. No, quietly. Everything you've done has been to secure your legacy, your reputation, your vision of what this family should be. Eleanor tried again to intervene. Please, both of you, let's go home and discuss this rationally. There's nothing to discuss, Claire interrupted. Dad's made his position clear. Now I'm making mine clear. I won't let you buy my happiness or dictate my choices anymore. Richard's face hardened. Then you leave me no choice. As of this moment, your accounts will be frozen. Your credit cards canceled. Your position at the foundation terminated. Richard, Eleanor gasped. No, Mom, it's fine. Claire said, a strange calm settling over her. Dad thinks he's punishing me, but he's actually setting me free. She walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, her hands shaking, but her mind clear. For the first time in her life, she felt truly independent. Terrified, yes, but also exhilarated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. You're making a huge mistake. Come home before it's too late. Claire turned off her phone and started walking, letting the city lights guide her way. She had no destination in mind, but for the first time, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. Jamal sat in the Columbia Law School library, surrounded by thick volumes of constitutional law, but his mind kept drifting to Claire. The news of her confrontation with her father had spread through certain circles, reaching him through his mother, who heard it from another housekeeper in their wealthy community. His phone showed a dozen missed calls from Claire. Each unanswered call felt like a physical weight on his chest. Finally, he stepped outside into the courtyard and dialed a number he'd memorized but tried to forget. Jamal? Claire's voice was thick with relief. I've been trying to reach you for days. I know. He closed his eyes, steeling himself. I heard what happened with your father. Then you know I've made my choice, Claire said firmly. I'm not letting them control me anymore. Claire, Jamal's voice cracked slightly. You can't throw away your entire life for me. I'm not throwing away anything. I'm choosing my own path. Your path shouldn't have to lead through poverty and struggle, Jamal replied, his words careful and measured. You don't understand what it's like to worry about basic necessities, to count every dollar. Then help me understand, Claire pleaded. We can figure this out together. No, Jamal's response was firm. I won't be the reason you lose everything. You're F. Adler's right about one thing. Good intentions don't pay bills. They don't create opportunities. So you're making decisions for me now? Just like them. The hurt in Claire's voice was palpable. I'm being realistic. The world isn't ready for us, Claire. Maybe it never will be. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were different. I thought you believed in fighting for what's right." "I do," Jamal responded, his throat tight. "That's why I have to let you go." He ended the call before she could respond, before his resolve could crumble. Returning to the library, he stared unseeing at his textbooks, the words blurring through unshed tears. The following weeks were a blur of gray days. Claire withdrew from her social circles completely, throwing herself into volunteer work at various community centers, though never the one where Jamal worked. She moved into a small apartment, took a job at a nonprofit focusing on educational equity, and tried to rebuild her life without her family's influence. Her new co-workers were surprised to learn her background, as she never mentioned the Morrison name. She learned to budget, to cook simple meals, to navigate the subway. But the emptiness Jamal left behind seemed to grow rather than diminish. One evening, while sorting through donated books for an after-school program, Claire found herself crying over a copy of a law textbook. Her colleague Maria noticed. "Want to talk about it?" Maria asked, sitting beside her. "I thought love was supposed to be enough," Claire replied, wiping her eyes. "That's what every story tells you. But maybe real life is more complicated." "Love is enough," Maria said gently. "But timing matters too. Sometimes people need to grow separately before they can grow together." Meanwhile, Jamal buried himself in his studies, taking extra classes and staying late at the library. But every time he helped a kid with their homework or gave advice about college applications, he thought of Claire and her genuine desire to make a difference. His mother noticed his depression during their weekly dinners. "You did the right thing," she assured him, though her eyes held doubt. "Then why does doing the right thing feel so wrong?" Jamal asked, pushing away his barely touched food. The separation affected them both in unexpected ways. Claire grew stronger, more independent, learning to stand on her own without family support or Jamal's presence. She started speaking at community events about educational inequality, drawing from her unique perspective of having seen both sides of the divide. Jamal excelled in his classes, but felt increasingly hollow with each achievement. His classmates celebrated their successes at bars he couldn't afford, planning futures at firms where they'd defend the interests of people like Claire's father. The irony wasn't lost on him. One night, unable to sleep, he drove past Claire's new apartment building. The lights were off, but he sat there anyway, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life in the name of doing the right thing. The law library had become Jamal's sanctuary and prison. Surrounded by case studies and legal precedents, he tried to focus on his constitutional law assignment. But his mind kept wandering to Claire's latest public appearance. She'd been featured in a local newspaper, speaking about educational inequality at a community forum. "Mr. Adams?" A young student intern interrupted his thoughts. "Professor Martinez wants to know if you'll be able to lead tomorrow's LSAT prep session." "Right, of course," Jamal replied, realizing he'd been staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes. Later that night, alone in his small apartment, Jamal pulled up the newspaper article on his laptop. Claire looked different in the photo, more mature, more confident. She stood at a podium, addressing a crowd about the importance of breaking down systemic barriers in education. His phone buzzed with a text from his study group. "Missed you at practice court today. Everything okay?" Nothing was okay. His grades were still excellent, but the passion that had driven him toward law school felt increasingly hollow. Every case study about equality and justice reminded him of his own hypocrisy, preaching about fighting systemic barriers while letting those same barriers dictate his heart. Across town, Claire stood at the podium of a charity gala. Not one of her family's usual social events, but a grassroots fundraiser for educational programs in underserved communities. The irony of using the public speaking skills her privileged upbringing had given her to fight against systemic inequality wasn't lost on her. "Personal experience has shown me that wealth doesn't just create educational advantages," she spoke clearly into the microphone. "It creates walls. Walls between communities, between opportunities, between hearts." She paused, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But walls can be torn down. Bridges can be built. Love can transcend social barriers, if we're brave enough to let it." In the audience, unknown to Claire, Jamal's mother sat listening. She'd come out of curiosity after hearing about Claire's work from other household staff. What she saw surprised her. Not a wealthy girl playing at charity, but a woman who had chosen to rebuild herself from the ground up. After the speech, during the mingling session, Claire found herself surrounded by community members sharing their stories. A young mother spoke about her dreams for her children's education. A high school student talked about his struggles to prepare for college without resources. "You really believe what you said?" A familiar voice cut through the crowd. "About love transcending barriers?" Claire turned to find Amara, Jamal's mother, standing before her. "Mrs. Adams," Claire's voice caught in her throat. "I didn't know you were here. I needed to see for myself," Amara said quietly. "My son hasn't been the same since." She trailed off. "Neither have I," Claire admitted. "But this work, helping these communities, it's not just about him anymore. It's about fighting the system that kept us apart." Amara studied her carefully. "You've changed." "We all have," Claire responded. "That's what growth looks like." The conversation was interrupted by event organizers asking Claire to meet some potential donors. As she walked away, Amara watched her with new eyes, seeing not the privileged girl who had dated her son, but a woman who had chosen to remake herself in the face of adversity. Later that night, Amara called Jamal. "I saw Claire today," she said without preamble. The silence on the other end was deafening. "She's different now," Amara continued. "Maybe you both are." "Mom, please," Jamal's voice was strained. "I can't." "Can't what?" "Face the fact that you might have been wrong. That sometimes protecting people means letting them make their own choices." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Rain fell steadily outside the community center as Claire finished setting up for an educational workshop. The sound of familiar footsteps made her freeze. She'd know that walk anywhere. Turning slowly, she found Jamal standing in the doorway, as soaked as he was uncertain. "Your mother said you'd be here," he said quietly. Claire's hands trembled as she stacked the last chair. "Funny, after all this time, you chose a rainy Tuesday to appear." "I saw your speech." He stepped into the room, water dripping from his coat. "The one about educational inequality. Someone posted it online. Did you come to critique my arguments about systemic barriers?" Claire's voice carried an edge. "Or just to make sure I'm suffering appropriately for my choices?" "You're angry," Jamal observed. "Angry?" Claire laughed without humor. "I'm furious. You did exactly what my father did, decided what was best for me without giving me a C. Hoist." The vulnerability in the room was palpable. Both stood their ground, separated by more than just physical distance. "I thought I was protecting you," Jamal admitted. "From poverty, from struggle, from what?" "Life." Claire stepped closer. "I've learned more about myself in these past months than I did in years of privilege. I know who I am now, who I want to be. And who is that? Someone who fights for what she believes in. Someone who doesn't let fear dictate her choices." She met his eyes directly. Someone who loves deeply enough to risk everything. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows. Jamal moved closer, close enough to see the subtle changes in Claire, the confident set of her shoulders, the determination in her eyes. "I've been a coward," he said softly, preaching about justice while letting fear control me. "We were both afraid," Claire acknowledged, "but I'm not anymore. I don't need my family's money or approval. I don't even need you to love me back. I just need to be true to myself. That's why I'm here." Jamal's voice cracked slightly. "Because the woman who spoke at that fundraiser, who built a new life from scratch, who fights for change instead of just talking about it, she's even more extraordinary than the girl I fell in love with." Claire felt tears forming, but held them back. Don't say these things unless you're ready to fight. Really fight. Because I won't go backwards, Jamal. I won't shrink myself to fit anyone's expectations anymore." "I know." He reached for her hand, hesitating just before touching it. "I've spent months trying to focus on law school, on my future. But every case I read about justice and equality just reminded me of my own hypocrisy. How can I argue for breaking down barriers in court if I let them defeat me in my own life?" Their fingers touched, sending electricity through both of them. The familiar chemistry was there, but something else too, a deeper understanding, a shared purpose. If we do this, Claire said carefully, we do it as equals. No more protecting each other from reality. No more letting fear win. Equals, Jamal agreed, finally taking her hand fully in his. Partners in everything, the struggles and the victories. The moment hung between them, heavy with possibility and the weight of their shared history. Outside, the rain began to ease, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The Morrison family estate loomed before Claire like a fortress. She stood at the iron gates, her hand hovering over the intercom. Behind her, Jamal waited in his car, having insisted on driving her despite her protests. Claire, her father's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and formal. Your mother said you wanted to talk. The gates swung open with a metallic groan. Claire walked up the familiar driveway, memories flooding back with each step. Sophie waited at the front door, her expression unreadable. They're in the study, Sophie said quietly. Are you sure about this? Claire straightened her shoulders. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Richard and Eleanor Morrison sat like royalty, holding court, their faces masks of disapproval. The study seemed smaller now to Claire, less intimidating than she remembered. If this is about money, Richard began, the answer is still no. It's not about money, Claire interrupted. It's about truth and choices. What truth? Her father scoffed. That you've thrown away everything we built for you? That you're working at a nonprofit for pocket change? The truth that I'm happier now than I've ever been, Claire replied steadily. That I've found purpose beyond maintaining appearances and social status. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Darling, we understand you want to prove a point. This isn't about proving points, Mom. This is about living authentically. Claire took a deep breath. And yes, about loving someone you don't approve of. Richard's FAC. Idarkind. The driver? Is that why you're here? To tell us you're still pursuing this fantasy? His name is Jamal. Claire's voice grew stronger. And he's waiting outside because I wanted to tell you something first. She moved to the window, gesturing toward the car. Look at him, Dad. Really look? What do you see? A threat to your social status? A servant who doesn't know his place? Richard remained stubbornly silent. I'll tell you what I see, Claire continued. I see someone who grew up with nothing but worked his way into Columbia Law School. Someone who could have taken a corporate job but chose to fight for community justice instead. Someone who tried to push me away because he thought it would protect me, just like you did. And that makes him suitable? Richard demanded. His noble intentions? No, Blade. What makes him suitable is that he loves me enough to let me make my own choices. To support me becoming who I want to be, not who anyone else thinks I should be. Eleanor stood suddenly. Claire, please. Think about your future. I am thinking about my future, Mom. A future where I'm true to myself. Where I fight for what I believe in. Claire's voice softened. Don't you remember what that feels like? To believe in something bigger than social status? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Eleanor's face. The community center where I work? Claire pressed on. We're helping kids get into college who never thought they had a chance. We're breaking cycles of poverty, creating real change. That's the legacy I want to build. Sophie, who had been silent in the doorway, finally spoke. She's different, Dad. Can you see it? She's stronger. Richard stood abruptly. Strength? You call throwing away every advantage we gave you strength? No, I call finding my own way strength. I call loving without condition strength. She moved toward the door. You can keep your money, your social connections, your carefully curated world. I've found something better, something real. As she reached for the door handle, her mother's voice stopped her. Wait! The annual Morrison Foundation Charity Gala buzzed with New York's elite, but something was different this year. The usual discussions of stock portfolios and summer homes were interrupted by whispers about the prodigal daughter and her controversial choices. Jamal stood at the podium, his Columbia Law School acceptance letter no longer a secret weapon, but a bridge between two worlds. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak, some faces showing curiosity, others thinly veiled disdain. When I was first asked to speak tonight about social justice and education, he began, I considered declining. After all, what could the Morrison family driver have to say to this distinguished audience? Richard Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Claire watched from the side, her heart racing. But then I remembered something my father taught me. Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger. He told me that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Those words meant little to me as a child, watching him lose everything he'd built. But now I understand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard's face had gone pale. My father was James Adams, Jamal revealed, his words landing like stones in still water. Some of you knew him. 20 years ago, he was sitting where you are now, before a market crash and betrayal by his partners cost him everything. Eleanor Morrison's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. He could have fought back, declared bankruptcy, protected some of his assets. Instead, he paid every investor back, down to the last dollar. He sacrificed everything to maintain his integrity. Jamal's eyes found Richard's, including his friendship with you, Mr. Morrison. The room was dead silent now. Claire stared at her father, understanding ning on her face. Dad, she whispered. You knew? Richard stood slowly, his composure cracking. James was more than my friend, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He was my partner. When the crash came, I could have helped him. Instead, I protected myself, my reputation, my fortune. Jamal nodded. My father never told me about your connection. I discovered it while researching cases for law school. He died believing that success was measured by the lives you touch, not the wealth you accumulate. When did you know? Claire asked, moving closer to Jamal. About our family's connection? After your father threatened to block my law school applications, Jamal admitted. I dug deeper, found the old records. That's why I pulled away. Not because I was afraid of poverty, but because I needed to understand if our love was real or just fate's way of settling old debts. Richard Morrison approached the podium slowly, every eye in the room following him. James Adams was the best man I ever knew, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. And I've spent 20 years trying to forget how I betrayed him. He turned to face Jamal directly. I saw him in you from the first day you applied for the driver position. The same integrity, the same quiet strength. I hired you because of it, and then I spent years afraid of what that meant. Claire reached for Jamal's hand, understanding flowing between them. Their love wasn't just a rebellion against social norms. It was redemption, a chance to heal old wounds and bridge divides that went beyond class and status. My father wanted me to be a force for change, Jamal concluded, addressing the crowd but speaking to Claire. Not through wealth or power, but through justice and love. Standing here tonight, I finally understand what he meant. True wealth isn't in our bank accounts. It's in our capacity to love, to forgive, to fight for what's right. The revelation transformed everything. Their love story was no longer just about defying social expectations, but about healing generational wounds, about choosing love over fear, truth over pretense. Richard Morrison stepped forward, tears visible in his eyes for the first time in his daughter's memory. James will be proud of you both, he said quietly. And I was a fool not to see it sooner. The story that began with a wealthy daughter and her family's driver ended with something far more profound, a testament to love's power to bridge divides, heal old wounds, and write new endings to stories long thought finished.